The dense forest whispered in the early morning light, and the mist hung low over the ground, clinging to the wet earth like a shroud, softening the edges as of the towering trees. Here, in the heart of an isolated wildlife sanctuary, animals roamed freely, untamed and unobserved by the bustling world outside. Only the occasional flutter of a bird's wings or the rustling of leaves betrayed the presence of life. The land was wild, untouched, a place where time seemed to stand still. In this remote corner of the sanctuary there was an old research station, a forgotten structure now barely held together by the surrounding undergrowth. Its metal walls were rusted and its windows cracked, yet inside there was an aura of quiet purpose. It had once been home to cutting-edge genetic research, a laboratory where the boundaries of science had been pushed to their limit. For the past few years, the station had been abandoned, its work left incomplete, its promises unfulfilled. But now someone had returned. A figure, cloaked in the remnants of the station's fading grandeur, moved through the thick trees. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and wet soil as the figure carefully navigated the overgrown trail. His boots crunched the dry leaves beneath, but he moved with purpose, knowing exactly where he was going. His destination was the center of the sanctuary, an area where few had ventured in years. He arrived at a clearing, a place where the forest opened up just enough to allow sunlight to filter through the dense canopy. In the middle stood a solitary structure, camouflaged by the thick growth. It was a dome-like building, constructed with high-tech materials and hidden behind layers of vines and branches. But it was no longer the future of innovation. It was the place where the greatest secret of the sanctuary had been conceived, a horse for the future. This was no ordinary horse. It was a creation born from the ambition to push the limits of nature, designed to be faster, stronger, and more resilient than any animal before it. A horse capable of breaking every record, of reaching speeds that no other creature could ever match. The figure, a scientist who had once been at the forefront of genetic engineering, paused before the entrance. His heart raced. He had been away too long, and the sanctuary's secrets had a way of settling deep into the earth, as if they were meant to remain buried forever. Yet now, there was no turning back. He entered the dome. Inside, the air smelled sterile, faintly metallic, as if the very walls had absorbed the work of decades. The machinery hummed with a low, persistent energy. The heart of the research project, the horse, stood in the middle of the room, an animal so magnificent it was almost unreal. Its coat was gleaming silver, its eyes sharp and intelligent, its muscles taut and powerful. For a moment, there was silence. The horse, which had been bred for a future beyond its time, was still. It was larger than any horse the scientist had seen, its build both graceful and intimidating. It stood tall, towering over him as if it had transcended the limitations of its kind. The scientist's fingers trembled slightly as he reached for the control panel, his mind racing. The data on the screen flashed in front of him. Genetic readings, physical parameters, speed metrics. Everything looked perfect. The horse was ready. But there was something else, a sense of unease he couldn't shake. The deeper he looked, the more he realized something was wrong. The horse's eyes shifted. It was subtle at first, a slight change in the animal's gaze, but it was enough to make the scientist stop in his tracks. His pulse quickened. The horse had always been a product of advanced genetic manipulation. Its strength, speed, and intellect carefully engineered. Yet the look in its eyes was something far more than science could account for. Suddenly, a rustling noise came from outside the dome, breaking the silence. The scientist froze. It wasn't an animal, it wasn't the wind. Footsteps. The sound was deliberate, the movement heavy, purposeful. Someone or something was out there. Panic set in. The scientist's breath caught in his throat. He knew he wasn't alone. The horse shifted again, its stance becoming tense. as though it could sense the same unease that had overtaken the man. Its muscles rippled, and the air seemed to vibrate with the energy of something wild, untamable. The scientist quickly turned to the door, ready to bolt, but as he stepped forward, he froze once more. His eyes widened in disbelief as the figure emerged from the shadows. A second horse, standing silently at the edge of the clearing. This one, however, was different. Its coat was jet black, its eyes dark pools of mystery. The animal moved with an unnatural grace, its body slightly translucent, as if it was not entirely of this world. For a long moment, neither the scientist nor the horse moved. The air between them was thick with tension, and time seemed to stretch out, the seconds weighing heavier than before. The first horse, his horse, snorted, a deep rumbling sound. It pawed the ground, its eyes flashing with recognition. The scientist felt a chill. The two horses were connected. Their very presence was intertwined in a way that he had not anticipated. The horse for the future was not the only one of its kind. The black horse, with its ethereal presence, was something else entirely. And then it happened. The black horse lowered its head and kicked up dust, sending a ripple through the earth. The air crackled with energy, the ground beneath the scientist's feet trembling as if the earth itself was waking up. His heart hammered in his chest and his mind raced. What had he done? What had he created? The two horses moved in unison, their movements so synchronized that they seemed to be a single entity. The air around them seemed to thicken, a palpable force that bent the trees around them. It was as though they were a force of nature, a convergence of something far beyond the scientist's understanding. The black horse raised its head, its eyes locking onto the scientist's. For a split second, he saw something in those eyes, a reflection of himself. The realization hit him like a wave. This horse, the black one, was the true creation. It wasn't just a genetic marvel. It was a manifestation of something deeper, something he had never anticipated. The horse for the future was only part of the equation. The black horse had been there all along, silently waiting. As the two horses began to run, faster than anything the scientist had ever seen, the earth seemed to open up beneath them, a rift in the natural order. The scientist stood frozen, watching them disappear into the distance, their forms becoming shadows in the mist. The sanctuary was alive, and the scientist realized with a sinking feeling that the future of the world had never been in his hands. It had always belonged to the animals who roamed it. The sanctuary, once a place of human ambition, had become something else entirely. It had become their world. The scientist stood motionless, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, the echo of the hooves fading into the vast silence of the forest. The mist had begun to thicken again, wrapping the sanctuary in an eerie, suffocating blanket. The weight of what had just unfolded pressed down on him like a storm cloud, its ominous presence suffusing the air. The two horses had vanished beyond the tree line, leaving nothing but a disturbed, trembling earth behind. For a moment, it seemed as if the forest itself had taken a collective breath, holding its own secrets tightly within the thick trunks of the trees. The scientist's mind raced, each thought more fragmented than the last. He had come here to see the culmination of years of work, to prove the success of his creation, but what he had witnessed was no scientific triumph. It was something beyond his comprehension, something beyond even his control. He turned slowly, glancing over the rusted machinery of the lab. The data on the screen, still flickering faintly, was a stark contrast to the natural chaos he had just experienced. It should have been his victory. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something much darker. His eyes fell on the control panel again. The readings, the genetic codes. It was all perfect. The horse, the original, was the pinnacle of genetic engineering. Yet, the black horse, that creation was something else entirely. It was as if it had transcended science itself. A being that could not be explained by the algorithms or measurements he had so carefully plotted. The bond between the two creatures, the silver horse and the black one, was something primal, a force that ignored all human understanding. A deep, shuddering breath escaped the scientist. He was no longer sure what he was dealing with. Had he unleashed something dangerous, something he couldn't control? Or had he merely been blind to the true power of nature all along? As he stepped away from the console, his attention was drawn back to the entrance of the dome. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed through the clearing. The earth beneath his feet seemed to hum with a new, unsettling energy. He looked over his shoulder, but there was no one. Just the endless stretch of trees and the thick fog that had now rolled in. Suddenly, the rustling returned. A different sound this time, far more distinct. It wasn't the wind or the wildlife, it was something. Moving. Coming closer. The scientist's heart skipped a beat as his eyes darted across the clearing, but there was no visible threat. Yet the air had changed. The horses were gone, but the sanctuary, the earth itself, felt alive, aware. It was as if the very land had taken on a consciousness of its own, watching him, judging him. And then, from the corner of his eye, a flash of movement caught his attention. Something large, something swift. It was at the edge of the forest. A silhouette emerged from the mist. The black horse. But this time, it wasn't alone. The silver horse had returned. The two animals stood side by side at the forest's edge, their bodies blending seamlessly with the mist. The black horse's eyes gleamed in the dim light, but now there was something more. An aura of quiet intelligence that radiated from it, as though it had learned, evolved, in ways that no one could have foreseen. The silver horse, its glossy coat reflecting the faint light, stood still, its muscles coiled with restrained power. Both horses seemed to watch him, but not with the eyes of animals. They were watching him as if they were seeing straight through him into the very core of his being. The ground beneath him trembled again, more violently this time. The trees around the clearing groaned, their trunks creaking as though bending under an unseen force. The leaves rustled, but not from the wind. It was as if the sanctuary itself was responding to the presence of these two horses. The horses were no longer mere creatures. They were the pulse of the sanctuary, its lifeblood. A sharp, almost electric tension filled the air, and the scientist felt his pulse quicken. He backed away slowly, unsure of what he had stumbled upon. The trees around the clearing began to sway, their movements unnatural, synchronized, as if the entire forest was preparing for something. He could no longer distinguish between the sound of the horse's hooves and the pounding of his own heart. Then, without warning, the black horse stepped forward, its hoofs silent against the earth. The silver horse followed, the two moving in perfect harmony. They didn't approach him with aggression, nor did they retreat. They simply moved, moving with a quiet power that suggested they were in complete control of their environment. The scientist could feel it. They were the ones in control now. His legs felt heavy as he watched them. The energy in the air was suffocating, and the ground seemed to pulse beneath his feet. It was as though the sanctuary was pushing him away, rejecting him for his role in bringing these creatures into existence. But more than that, it was rejecting his dominance. The land no longer answered to him. It answered to the horses, and then, in a flash, they were gone. The black horse and the silver horse faded into the mist once more, their forms dissolving into the thickening fog like shadows retreating from the light. The hum in the air died down, the trembling earth settling once again into stillness. For several moments, the scientist stood frozen in place, his mind reeling, his body rooted to the spot. He hadn't seen them leave. He had only felt them depart, as though the world had suddenly returned to normal, but the weight of what had transpired lingered in his chest like a vice. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, staring at the empty clearing, the forgotten research station behind him. The mist swirled around him, the faintest traces of movement in the trees signaling the return of wildlife. Unaware of what had just happened, he had come to the sanctuary searching for answers, for validation, for the next step in human progress. But now, standing alone in the heart of the forest, surrounded by the echoes of something far greater than he could ever understand, he realized that he was no longer a part of the equation. His role in this place had ended. The sanctuary was no longer his. It had always belonged to the creatures who roamed it, those with a power far beyond his reach. The sound of the wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest whisper. The future was never meant to be in human hands. And as the last of the mist curled around the treetops, the sanctuary returned to its quiet, timeless existence, leaving behind only the memory of two horses who had transcended the future. The mist hung thick in the air, but it was no longer the soft veil it had once been. It was now an oppressive shroud that clung to the scientist's skin, his breath short as he stood in the clearing, feeling the weight of time pressing down on him. The forest, once a quiet sanctuary, now felt like a living entity, a vast ancient being that had watched him with judgmental eyes. The horses, those creatures, had vanished, but the echoes of their presence remained, lingering in the very soil beneath his feet. The scientist's legs felt like lead as he stumbled backward toward the lab, his mind still grasping for logic, for some explanation to calm the storm that raged in his chest. But there was no explanation. There was only the silence of the forest, which now seemed deafening, and the hum of machinery that buzzed quietly in the distance, as though mocking him for thinking he could control this place. He reached the door to the lab, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal. Inside, the dim glow of the screens was almost peaceful in contrast to the wild chaos of the outside world. He stepped in, closing the door behind him with a soft click. For a moment, he leaned against the cool surface, allowing himself a few seconds to collect his thoughts, to regain some sense of control. But control had always been an illusion. The data on the monitors blinked back at him, the graphs and charts unchanged since his last glance. The progress of the horses, the original horse and its dark counterpart, had been steady, predictable, but now he saw that his research was outdated. The creatures he had created were no longer the product of genetic engineering. They had evolved beyond the design, far beyond his comprehension. They had become something else entirely. The scientist sat down heavily in his chair, his mind racing, attempting to piece together the fragments of what had just occurred. He had designed these horses to be faster, stronger, more adaptable to the harsh conditions of the sanctuary, but what he hadn't accounted for was their evolution, a shift that could not have been predicted, a force that could not be controlled by any of the tools he had. What did it mean for the future of his work? What did it mean for humanity, for his understanding of nature and its boundaries? Were they, the horses, the key to some new frontier? One that defied logic and science as he had known it. The thought should have been thrilling. Instead, it made him uneasy. He rose from his chair and walked over to the large observation window that overlooked the sanctuary grounds. The mist had not lifted. If anything, it had grown denser, thicker, wrapping itself around the trees like the fingers of an unseen hand. The world outside had become obscured, hidden beneath layers of fog and shadow, a world beyond his reach. But then, from the corner of his eye, a flicker of movement. He turned sharply. The black horse stood at the edge of the clearing once again, its dark form almost indistinguishable from the shadowed forest behind it. But this time it was not alone. The silver horse was there too, their presence like a living, breathing paradox in the stillness of the world. Together, they were a force, a presence that emanated not just from the horses themselves, but from the land that cradled them. The scientist's heart skipped a beat, his breath catching in his throat. The horse's eyes, those eyes, shone with an almost otherworldly gleam, and then, as if on some unseen cue, they began to move again, walking slowly, purposefully, into the mist. Their movements were fluid, powerful, but deliberate. They were no longer confined to the realm of flesh and bone. They were the embodiment of something older, something beyond the reach of human hands.